Hello and welcome to Dialogue. In a report released Monday, a UN investigator has called for the U.S. government to apologize for the inhuman treatment of detainees at the Guantanamo Bay detention camp in Cuba and to shut down the facility. Her visit is the first by an independent investigator in the 2 decades the facility has been operational. The international community has long denounced the rights violations at Guantanamo Bay, including forced feedings and beatings of detainees and a lack of due process. So how are things going on now in the detention center? Will any U.S. officials be held accountable for torture, rendition, and other ill treatment? And when will the prison be closed? To find out more, I'm joined by Victor Gao Zhikai, chair professor from Soochow University, Brandon Andrews, former Hill staffer, and Huo Zhengxin, professor of law from China University of Political Science and Law. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. Brandon, I will start with you. The report is out. Are you surprised with the discovery?
No, not surprised here. Look, the reality is no one in the United States wants to indefinitely detain anyone. There have been people that have been radicalized over the past 20 plus years. And the question is, after they have been detained, what do you do with them? For many of the folks, their home countries where they've had citizenship actually don't want them back. And so not surprised that the UN is pushing to close Gitmo, not surprised that the UN still has some issues with detainment and some of the legal processes. However, the Biden administration has shown that they're moving with all deliberate speed towards transferring as many detainees out of Guantanamo Bay and perhaps, closing the facility within the first term.
Mm-hmm. But Brandon, you think the Biden administration, for example, the officials, they are concerned with the fact, being discovered in the report that, 16 out of these 30 prisoners right now, they have been there without due process, without any charges?
Yet, so there's a difference between without due process and without charges. Now, it is public knowledge that enhanced interrogation techniques were used to obtain information from a number of the detainees. And because of that, in the ability to use evidence received from using some of those enhanced interrogation techniques, there is a legal question as to what evidence can be used, what evidence can't be used. And so that in some cases does prevent some of the detainees there from being charged. However, there's no one at the Guantanamo Bay facility that wasn't caught in the act, if you will. So these people were detained while on the battlefield in Afghanistan or other places around the world. They were caught with bomb-making supplies, potentially in the United States or elsewhere. And so these are folks that are high-value detainees that have been detained. And although the United Nations brought up the fact that some of them have not yet been charged, the reality is every detainee has legal representation that's paid for by the United States. So over $6 billion US dollars have been spent on the Guantanamo Bay facility over the years, and a lot of it has been actually spent on getting legal representation for the detainees themselves and also upgrading the facilities. It was originally intended to be a temporary solution, but has become a semi-permanent solution, and when that was realized, some upgrades were made.
Mm-hmm. Victor, so the issue, is it more about a legal matter or is it more about a human rights standard here? Obviously, the report is focusing on the human rights abuses, inhuman treatment about those prisoners.
Absolutely. I think Guantanamo Bay prison is the embodiment of double standards and disregard of the prisoners' civil rights and the denial of due process and torture and inhumane treatment of these prisoners of war, many of whom have been held without official charges and under very inhuman conditions. And the purpose of all these arrangements is to force confession from these prisoners of war. And I think all that had been dealt with in the Guantanamo Bay prison is actually complete violation of the domestic laws in the United States if it has taken place within the territory of the United States. And the fact that such violations have taken place in Guantanamo Bay doesn't reduce the severity of such violations, because after all, the prisoners of war are still human beings, and they still have entitlements as human beings to human rights protection, to due process, to the basic treatment of a human being in decency and dignity. Therefore, I think the world is appalled by the violations of the human rights of these prisoners of war in Guantanamo Bay, and I think it is real time to close down Guantanamo Bay prison as quickly as possible, and for the United States to undertake that they will never commit such gross violations of the basic rights and the human rights and the due process of the prisoners of war as they have been committing and found guilty of in the Guantanamo Bay prison.
Professor Huo Zhengxin, according to the report, 30 men still held in the prison are subject to, quote, ongoing cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment under international law. Of course, it's also a legal matter, and international law is not right. And 19 of the 30 detainees have never been charged with any crime, some of whom have been held in the military camp for 2 decades. I mean, this is a long time. How many 2 decades we have for one life? What do you make of the discovery?
The Guantanamo Bay is situated in Cuba. So the U.S. tried to create a lawless land, because if the Guantanamo Bay were in the territory of the U.S. land, then the U.S. Constitution should be applied. And so this is a typical American rules to create a space without law. However, as our colleague says, that these detainees are also protected by international law. For example, the UN Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment, and also the international covenants on civil and political rights. So I think that the existence and operation of Guantanamo Bay is a violation of international law by the U.S. government.
So, Brandon, it's, there's a consideration of the U.S. Constitution, of the U.S. domestic law, but do you think there's enough consideration of following the international law?
Yeah, when it comes to international law, we get in a sticky situation because these detainees, many of them don't actually align with a specific nation state. And when you want to apply the Geneva Convention specifically applies to conflict, to war between two states, between two nation states. And so if you have an organization like an Al-Qaeda or an organization like the Taliban or any other of a number of terrorist organizations around the world that are inserting themselves into conflict or that are starting armed conflict with nation states, the current range of international law that's generally accepted does not specifically provide for how do you deal with them. And historically, a lot of these, what would be maybe termed as unlawful belligerents or non-combatants that are acting in a combatant status, if you want to refer to the Geneva Convention to Article 4, a lot of these folks have just been subject to summary execution. And that's not something that the United States has done, but that's been historically how a lot of these folks that are non-combatants or unlawful combatants have been dealt with over the years. The United States made a decision to try to detain as many folks as possible, both to respect human rights, but also for intelligence gathering. And so I think this step from the UN getting unfettered access to Guantanamo Bay is a step in the right direction, not only for the United States, but hopefully for other UN member states where the UN has asked to come into facilities and get unfettered access, to give technical assistance and to report on the conditions. Many other countries around the world haven't done it. I think the United Nations should also take a step to help coalesce the world around how do you actually, from a legal standpoint, deal with these combatants who, in some cases, pretend to be non-combatants, but then become combatants who aren't aligned with a specific nation state, but who nonetheless are intending to do harm, whether it's to the United States or to other countries around the world.
Well, Brandon, this is the first time, for the unfettered, basically blocked access to the prison by the UN investigator. In 20 years, why does it take so long to have this free access for investigation?
Yeah, well, for a long time, there were significant security concerns, and there weren't really any outside visitors that were visiting the facility. You had President Obama over a decade ago say that he wanted to close the facility for a number of reasons. That didn't happen. You had President Trump come in and say, no, we need to use the facility. And now we're back to the Biden administration, who of course was vice president to President Obama. And Biden has said, yes, we need to move with all deliberate speed to transfer detainees out and hopefully close the facility within his first term. And so there were safety concerns, I think, originally. Many of these detainees are not necessarily compliant detainees. They use everything from feces to whatever they can get their hands on to resist being detained, and so it probably wasn't safe for folks to come in for a while. But again, this is a step in the right direction when it comes to not just Guantanamo Bay and transferring detainees out, but again on the international stage, making sure that the United Nations and that UN member states are giving the UN access to facilities to be able to do these kinds of reports, because we all need to step into the light together and ensure that human rights are protected.
Mm-hmm. Victor, as far as I remember, some of the folks, yes, probably a majority of them were caught in the battlefield, but some of them are just ordinary folks. Well, they were walking on the street, they were taken away by the U.S. intelligence officers and then put in the prison somewhere they never know, and then kept for decades. But for whatever reason, you have to give them some charges. Give the reasons why they are held there. You cannot hold them there indefinitely. There's something wrong over there, right?
I think whether these people who have been held in Guantanamo Bay prison are nationals of a country versus another country, etc., it doesn't reduce or minimize or eliminate the need to protect their basic human rights. And that also mandates that if you have any suspicions about their wrongdoing or criminality, for example, you need to apply a due process to get to the bottom of this, rather than wantonly arrest them and hold them without lawful charge, for example, and without due process in going through the background for these individuals. Because otherwise, you are really in violation of the basic human rights to start with. And what you are doing is really not befitting the basic norms of any civilized nation in the world. And that's exactly what the United States wants to hide from the world. They do not have the courage to try these people, to hold these people inside the United States. They want to do that in Guantanamo Bay, as if, for example, it is a piece of land which is not subject to basic human decency. And this is exactly what is very against basic human decency and morality or legality, for example. And this is exactly why this Guantanamo Bay prison need to be closed down. And the United States need to come to a full account of all the illegalities and criminalities which have been committed inside the Guantanamo Bay regarding quite a number of dozens of people involved, And many of these people actually have been really deprived of the basic dignity and human decency by the government of the United States. It is a notorious shame, and nobody should stand out to justify what the United States has been doing to these people held illegally inside the Guantanamo Bay prison.
Well, Zhengxin, of course, there are probably some differences, like a prisoner of war, their treatment, but there are also international law we need to follow, and then there's a terrorists, all terrorist suspects or people probably rendition, black sites in the past decades there. But fundamentally, it doesn't matter where they are from, or from a certain country, or war prisoners, but there are some rights need to be protected.
Yes, one of the arguments that these detainees are not subject to the Geneva Convention by the U.S. government is that they are called enemy combatants. Therefore, they are not prisoners of war. However, it's only a artificial allegation by the U.S. government. Anyway, no matter where they come from, no matter what the status of these detainees, they are human beings. Therefore, they enjoy and they should enjoy the human rights enshrined by the UN Charter, UN Declaration of Human Rights. So I think that the operation of the Guantanamo Bay by the U.S. government, obviously, they violates international humanitarian law and also violates human rights of these detainees.
So is that the reason you see there's, the UN report expressed, quote unquote, is a profound concern about the treatment of the prisoners, and for many years, human rights groups have been, asking for the closure of the prison, of course, accusing the U.S. of this, torture. Previously, of course, a lot of reports of forced feeding or beating of prisoners. That's obviously, I guess, if you follow any standards, people would say that's wrong, simply. But then, Brandon, here, there is a case, now we know there's only 30 prisoners there. How necessary is it for the U.S. to keep that site?
Yeah, I'll pose this question to you, and I think it'll help to frame things. So let's say a Chinese citizen left Shanghai 25 years ago, moved to Afghanistan, became radicalized, and either was caught on the battlefield fighting alongside the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, or perhaps caught in the United States with bomb-making materials. They were brought to Guantanamo Bay. They were interrogated. They were provided access to legal representation. Maybe at some point they had a change of heart and recanted their kind of former affiliation. Maybe they don't. But would the government of China want that person back in China? And would you, as a Chinese citizen, want that person in a facility in your city or in your area? And so that is the big question that requires Guantanamo Bay to continue to be open. It's not that the U.S. wants to detain people indefinitely. The fact of the matter is significant negotiations have to be done to get these people, to get these detainees to be transferred to other countries outside of Guantanamo Bay, because in many cases, their home country doesn't want to accept them back. And so we know that a key piece of the Biden doctrine is multinational, multilateral relationships, building relationships on the international stage. The United States can't force countries to take their citizens back, especially after some of the heinous crimes that these detainees have committed. And there's only so many favors that the Biden administration has to ask of other players on the international stage. And so the requirement is to have a humane place to house these people while one, trials move forward, and then two, while negotiations move forward to hopefully find a more permanent place for them to be, because again, many of their home countries don't want them back.
Victor, so basically there's no place to put those people, and that's why they are under basically the guardian of the United States. But then why the UN is accusing the US of mistreating those folks?
Allow me to disagree with what the previous panelist just now said. For the record, I know for sure that there are Chinese nationals being detained in Guantanamo Bay prison. The Chinese government's position is that the United States need to return these Chinese nationals from Guantanamo Bay prison to China, because China has the jurisdiction over these nationals of China, and they need to go through due process in China. I know also many of these Chinese nationals being kept in capacity in the Guantanamo Bay prison were Chinese Uyghurs. And therefore, the right thing is exactly for the United States to return these Chinese nationals, many of whom were Uyghurs, to China for due process, for investigation, for rule of law, according to Chinese laws, rather than, for example, to deny China jurisdiction over these Chinese nationals. I'm not going to comment upon other countries whose nationals may be held in captivity inside the Guantanamo Bay prison, but for the Chinese nationals, I'm pretty sure China's demand is the legitimate one. The United States need to return these Chinese nationals to China to go through the due process according to Chinese law. And it is completely absurd that the United States has denied again and again and again to return these Chinese nationals to China for due process and rule of law processing.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zhengxin, here is another question, of course.
To that?
Yeah, Brandon, go ahead.
Very, very quickly. The issue with the Uyghurs that have been detained at Guantanamo Bay is that the United Nations has a non-refoulement standard. So the United States or any country that detains a citizen can't send that person to a country or to a place where they may be in danger or where they may be in a position to be treated even worse. And so the United Nations has, just in 2022, released a report about the treatment of Uyghurs in China. And if the United States is to keep with the international standards and to respect the United Nations, that non-refoulement piece would prevent them from being transferred.
Yeah, I think it's obviously before 2022, Victor. The Chinese demand for the release of the Uyghurs.
Allow me to emphasize one point. If anyone in the world believes that the prisoners or the people held in captivity inside the Guantanamo Bay would have received worse treatment in China or anywhere else, I think he or she is indulging in his or her fantasy. I think the treatment meted out from Guantanamo Bay is the worst you can expect anywhere in the world. And for anyone to talk about worse treatment in China or anywhere else is distorting facts, is really misguiding the people in the world. I would dare to say, come up with any real analysis that any country in the world can give out worse treatment and violation of human rights of these people being held in captivity in Guantanamo Bay. The U.S. record, as far as Guantanamo Bay prison is concerned, is the worst, period. I think the United States government need to be held accountable and responsible for the worst violation of human rights in Guantanamo Bay prison.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zhengxin, obviously, if you follow the UN report and a lot of human rights organizations, there's accountability. I think there's a little disagreement in terms of this mistreatment. For example, forced feedings, beatings of detainees, obviously against violating human rights here. But why do you think there ever will be any U.S. government, U.S. officials be held accountable for the wrongdoing?
I think that so far we do not find any, any suggestion that the U.S. would take these people accountable according to the U.S. law or international law. The reason is quite obvious that the very reason why the United States operate Guantanamo Bay in the territory of Cuba instead of in the U.S. territory is try to evade U.S. law. Therefore, which law governs the actions happened in Guantanamo Bay is a matter of dispute. So I think that this kind of United States try to create a legal vacuum, and this will make the matter to take the U.S. concerned officials to justice of law is a matter of is a very difficult problem.
Mm-hmm. Difficult problem, but of course, Guantanamo Bay itself is, to say the least, is controversial because Cuba has been slamming the U.S. for occupying their territory for some 120 years, and of course use it to host those detainees. And now there's a report of mistreatment, inhuman treatment of those detainees. So is there any role for Cuba to play, or after all, it's a Cuban territory? So Brandon, do you think there's any likelihood the U.S. at some point of time in the future will return this piece of territory to Cuba?
That's certainly something that could happen. I think the Biden administration for now is just focused on transferring as many detainees out as possible. 4 were transferred just in the past month or so, and they've kind of indicated that we should expect more transfers here in the near term. We've got to take that step first before we get to the broader step. And just again, in response to the previous panelists, if China believes that the treatment of Uyghurs would be better, then according to the United Nations report, the same UN envoy that visited Guantanamo Bay put out a report about Uyghur treatment last year and asked to have the same kind of visit to Xinjiang, to the Uyghur camps that the United States has allowed the United Nations to have to Guantanamo Bay. That has to be the first step, opening things up, again, stepping into the light together to make sure that the UN, an unbiased third party, can say that it's safe for them to be transferred.
But still, we need to keep in mind the fact that it takes 20 years for the UN to have unfettered access to this prison. And of course, it's beyond the Guantanamo Bay prison, Victor here, except for this prison over the past years, the US has set up such jails known as black sites in at least 54 countries and regions to secretly detain so-called terrorist suspects. Suspects here is the key element here, to extort confessions by torture. Some say Guantanamo Bay is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of human rights violations. So probably there's more to be discovered or more to be investigated. Victor.
Is that?
This is a very important question. We know for sure, and the world knows, that many of the people held in Guantanamo Bay prison are Muslims. And therefore, the United States actually is suffering the huge consequences, because not only the Muslim people throughout the world know what the United States is dealing with the Muslims in Guantanamo Bay prison, they also know what the United States is dealing with Muslims in these black cells, as you mentioned, in different parts of the world. Now, this actually significantly diminishes the significance and the importance and the relevance of the United States in the eyes of the Muslim world throughout the world. And eventually, it will come back to haunt the United States. Therefore,
thank you.
Deal with these people.
We have to stop
with
there.
dignity.
We are running out of time. Thank you, Victor. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. Thank you for watching. See you next time.